Have you ever noticed that some people seem almost impossible to pressure? They don't feel the need to announce every opinion online. They rarely chase the newest trend. They can disappear for a weekend without telling the world where they are, and somehow, they're completely okay with it. If you've met someone like that, there's a good chance they're part of Generation X. For years, Generation X has quietly existed between two louder generations. Baby boomers are often described as the traditional generation. Millennials are constantly discussed because they transformed workplaces and technology. Gen Z dominates conversations about social media and internet culture. And Generation X? They somehow became almost invisible. But here's the interesting part. Psychologically, that invisibility may have shaped one of the most independent generations in modern history. So why does Generation X often seem emotionally self-reliant? Why are they less interested in approval from strangers? And why do so many psychologists describe them as adaptable, skeptical, and surprisingly resilient? The answers begin long before smartphones, streaming services, or social media ever existed. Imagine growing up in a world where boredom wasn't considered a problem that needed solving. You finished your homework, you went outside, you came home when the streetlights turned on. No GPS, no group chats, no constant notifications. If you wanted to call a friend, you picked up a phone attached to a wall. If they weren't home, that was the end of the conversation until tomorrow. To younger generations, that almost sounds unbelievable. But to Generation X, it was normal. And that normal environment trained the brain in ways that psychologists are only beginning to appreciate. Human beings adapt to the environments they grow up in. Your brain isn't designed simply to remember information. It's designed to predict what kind of world you're living in. If your world constantly provides instant feedback, your brain begins expecting instant feedback. If your world requires patience, uncertainty, and figuring things out alone, your brain becomes comfortable with those conditions instead. Generation X spent much of childhood practicing something modern life rarely demands anymore: solving problems without immediate help. That doesn't automatically make one generation stronger than another. It simply creates different psychological habits. Think about learning to ride a bicycle. If someone runs beside you forever, you'll always depend on them balancing the bike. Eventually, they have to let go. Generation X often experienced that letting go much earlier in life. Many researchers have even nicknamed them the latchkey generation. After school, millions returned to empty homes because both parents were working. They made snacks, finished homework, entertained themselves, and handled small responsibilities independently. Was it always ideal? Probably not. Did it create stress? Absolutely. But psychology teaches us something fascinating about manageable stress. When people successfully overcome small challenges repeatedly, they develop what psychologists call self-efficacy, the belief that they can handle future problems. It's not confidence based on compliments. It's confidence built from experience. That's an important difference. Compliments disappear. Experience stays with you. This may explain why many members of Generation X often appear calm during uncertainty. It's not that they never worry. It's that they've spent decades practicing adaptation. Another interesting trait is skepticism. Generation X has often been described as one of the least trusting generations. At first glance, that sounds negative. But psychologically, skepticism isn't necessarily cynicism. There's a difference. Cynicism assumes everyone has bad intentions. Healthy skepticism simply asks, is this actually true? Generation X witnessed enormous cultural changes. They watched television become dominant. They saw advertising explode. They experienced economic uncertainty, corporate restructuring, political scandals, and the birth of the internet. Over time, many developed a habit of questioning what they were told. Not because they enjoyed arguing, because experience taught them that appearances aren't always reality. Ironically, that's becoming an increasingly valuable skill today. Every day we're surrounded by headlines, algorithms, edited videos, and carefully curated online identities. The ability to pause before believing something may be one of the healthiest psychological habits anyone can develop. Then there's privacy. Have you noticed how many Gen X adults simply don't feel the need to share everything? Someone asks how they're doing. Fine. End of conversation. To younger generations, this can seem emotionally distant. But psychology offers another perspective. Privacy isn't always emotional avoidance. Sometimes privacy is simply emotional ownership. Not every feeling needs an audience. Not every success needs applause. Not every difficult moment needs to become content. Generation X grew up during a time when personal identity developed largely offline. Your reputation existed among people who actually knew you. Today, identity often expands into thousands, or even millions, of strangers. Neither system is perfect, but they produce different emotional expectations. One encourages internal validation. The other often encourages external validation. This doesn't mean one generation is right and another is wrong. It simply means our environments shape the way we define ourselves. Another hidden psychological pattern appears in how Generation X approaches change. Here's the irony. People often assume they're resistant to new technology. But Generation X experienced one of the greatest technological revolutions in human history. They remember cassette tapes, CDs, DVDs, desktop computers, dial-up internet, smartphones, streaming, artificial intelligence. They didn't grow up inside one technological world. They survived several completely different ones. Imagine learning the rules of a game, only for someone to replace the entire game every few years. That's essentially what happened. From a psychological perspective, repeated adaptation builds cognitive flexibility. Your brain becomes less attached to one way of doing things. Instead, it quietly develops the belief, I've figured things out before, I'll figure this out too. Perhaps that's why many Gen X adults seem surprisingly calm when life changes unexpectedly. They've been adapting their entire lives. But no generation is without struggles. Generation X often carries invisible emotional burdens. Because they learned independence so early, asking for help can sometimes feel uncomfortable. There's an unspoken belief that says, I'll handle it myself. Most of the time, that's useful. Sometimes, it's exhausting. Psychologists have found that resilience isn't about never needing support. True resilience includes knowing when to lean on other people. Even the strongest bridge depends on many connected pieces. Humans work the same way. One fascinating study from social psychology found that people often overestimate how much others judge them. Researchers call this the spotlight effect. We imagine everyone notices our mistakes. Everyone remembers our awkward moments. Everyone is evaluating us. In reality, most people are too busy thinking about themselves. Generation X often seems naturally resistant to this effect. Perhaps because much of life happened before social media created a constant audience. Without realizing it, many developed a quieter relationship with attention itself. Not every moment needed witnesses. And that's psychologically freeing. Think about hiking through a forest. Would the experience become more meaningful if you spent the entire walk checking whether strangers approved of your photos? Or would you notice more simply by looking around? Attention is a limited resource. Where you place it shapes your experience of life. Generation X, intentionally or not, often learn to place more attention on reality than performance. That doesn't mean they don't enjoy recognition. Everyone does. Humans are social creatures. We all want to feel valued. The difference is where that value comes from. External approval feels exciting. Internal confidence feels peaceful. And peace usually lasts longer. Perhaps that's the hidden psychology of Generation X. It's less about toughness, less about nostalgia, less about being better. It's about growing up in an environment that rewarded patience, independence, adaptability, and quiet confidence. Those psychological habits didn't appear overnight. They formed through thousands of ordinary experiences that, together, shaped an entire generation. Maybe that's why Generation X often seems so difficult to define. They're not constantly trying to define themselves. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson anyone can take from them. Your identity doesn't have to be performed every day. It doesn't need constant updates. It doesn't require endless comparison. Who you are is built in the ordinary moments when nobody is watching. When you solve a problem on your own. When you stay calm during uncertainty. when you question easy answers, when you choose authenticity over attention. Those moments quietly shape your mind far more than any viral trend ever could. Whether you're Generation X, a millennial, Gen Z, or part of Generation Alpha someday watching this years from now, the psychology behind these traits belongs to all of us. Because resilience isn't inherited from a birth year. It's built through experience. Independence isn't about doing everything alone. It's about believing you can face life's challenges while still allowing yourself to grow. And maybe that's the real story hidden beneath Generation X. Not the forgotten generation, not the overlooked generation, but the generation that reminds us something we've slowly started to forget. You don't always have to be the loudest person in the room to have the strongest mind. Sometimes the quietest confidence leaves the deepest impression. So what do you think? Do you recognize these traits in yourself, someone in your family, or a friend who's part of Generation X? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear which of these psychological patterns felt most familiar. And if you enjoy exploring the hidden science behind human behavior, make sure to subscribe, because there are many more fascinating journeys into the human mind waiting for you.